It's really important, though, not to get confused here. When we're talking about ridership routes and routes that will carry a lot of people, and when we're talking about coverage routes or routes that exist basically to provide some basic service in that place, we shouldn't get that confused with the distinction between choice riders and dependent riders. And in fact, I think this is a very problematic distinction in general. It's problematic, I think, for three reasons, really. One is, it divides the world into two groups of people when in fact it is a spectrum. There are people who can just barely afford a car, who are paying for that car because they really have no other choice, who would have lots of other ways to spend that money that would improve their life if they weren't paying for the car. In fact, we know there's quite a few people in the United States who own a car and can't afford it. The subprime car loan industry and the repossession rates on those car loans are telling you there's a lot of people in the position of desperation who really, they're probably scrimping on groceries or scrimping on toys for their kids and barely making it add up, or in the end not making it add up in order to have a car. I don't think of that as a choice rider. That doesn't sound to me like a person who's in a position of luxurious choices. Secondly, I think that when we start talking about choice riders, we get the wrong picture in our head. We get the idea of a lawyer in a suit driving their Mercedes to a park and ride. And that's not really a useful group to design for. When we start talking about choice riders is when we start focusing too much on things like trips to the airport. What Jarrett Walker calls elite projection, where transit planners and transit board members and elected officials design transit for themselves. And transit board members and transit planners tend to fly a lot. I fly to a lot of places. I go through a lot of airports. I shouldn't take that to mean that the average person lives the same life that I do. So talking about choice riders to me actually gets us into problematic frames, and it gets us very quickly into the idea where we think certain people are worth more money, that it is worth spending more money to attract a choice rider than somebody else. And I also think we get in real trouble when we start thinking about dependent riders, because once you take somebody for granted, you tend to not treat them well. And the reality is, everybody who is using the bus today deserves good transit service too. Getting a human being to work is good transit. And if you look at successful transit systems, they really break down this divide. The New York subway, well, when it's not having delays, is great service. And what you will see on the New York subway is everybody who lives in New York rides it, regardless of race, regardless of income, regardless of neighborhood, they're all on that subway. And that means that service is good enough that there's people who could afford a car who have chosen not to have a car because the subway is there for them, and that's great. But that same high quality service is also great for the people who could not have afforded a car, because that subway is reliable, it's fast, it gets them where they need to go, it's frequent. And that's what we should be aiming for. We should be aiming for transit that's good enough for everybody. And I think another one of the big misconceptions is the idea that somehow white-collar professionals value time more than people who are low income. I have heard this a remarkable amount, and it's frankly ridiculous. Somebody who's juggling multiple service jobs as well as childcare, they don't have time to spare. We can't say, oh, it's okay that we have a slow and infrequent bus and that'll be fine for them. And especially the margin of error is less. If you work as a waiter and you show up late to work, you get fired. If I show up late to work, everyone assumes I was having a business development meeting, and it's perfectly fine. And obviously, money matters here too. If you have money, you can go to Whole Foods and buy a prepared meal. If you don't have money, you need time to cook. So really valuing everybody, I think, is part of making good transit. So what does it take to make good transit? First of all, let's understand basically what transit is. Transit is a vehicle that is big enough to hold multiple people, and the key is they all have to be going in the same direction. Transit is not a transformer that can split into three parts, and that makes transit fundamentally different than cars. To draw ridership, transit needs to move lots of people in a straight line, and to be even more specific, it needs to combine lots of different kinds of trips. A successful bus route is lots of long trips and short trips combined together. If you get on a bus and look around you, you will not see the same people on that bus for your entire trip. You'll see new people get on, other people get off. That's what makes transit work. And there is a huge variety in how successful transit is. This is a chart of different rail transit lines in the United States compared in performance, and you look at how different those bars are. The best performing light rail line in the country carries more than 10 times as many people per mile as the worst performer. I'll say Pittsburgh is actually down near the bottom of that scale. So what that shows you is that the decisions we make about where to build transit make a real big difference.